The wind howled across the channel, carrying with it the briny scent of the sea and the promise of an uncertain future. For the men on the deck of Julius Caesar's ships, the cliffs of Britain loomed like an ominous spectre. This was not just another military campaign, it was a journey into the unknown. These were men of the Roman Republic, hardened by years of conquest across Gaul. Yet many among them harboured silent doubts. Britain, that distant and mysterious land, had always been shrouded in myth and legend. No Roman army had ever set foot on its shores. That was about to change. The year was 55 BCE, and Caesar had set his sights on new horizons. What followed would be a battle that would test not only the strength of Rome's finest, but the resolve of their ambitious commander. This was the Battle of the Beachhead. When Julius Caesar first contemplated crossing the English Channel, his reasons were manifold. On the surface, the invasion of Britain was a natural extension of his conquests in Gaul, where many of the local tribes had long-standing ties with their cousins across the water. The Britons, as the Romans called them, had reportedly sent support to the Gallic tribes that opposed Roman domination. Caesar, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity to sever this connection and secure his northern frontier. But beneath this tactical reasoning lay a more personal ambition. Caesar sought glory, fame, and the prestige of doing what no Roman had done before, planting the eagle standard of Rome on British soil. The crossing itself was no small feat. With roughly 100 ships, Caesar ferried 2 legions, about 10,000 men, across the choppy waters of the Channel. The Roman fleet was well equipped, but the soldiers on board could feel the tension in the air. The unfamiliarity of the sea unnerved many, as did the uncertainty of what awaited them on the other side. The Britons were a mysterious people to the Romans, known only through vague reports and second-hand accounts. Would they be fierce warriors, ready to defend their homeland to the death? Or would they cower before the might of Rome, as so many others had done before? As the coastline of Britain came into view, Caesar's worst fears were realized. The Britons had not been idle. From the decks of their ships, the Roman soldiers could see a vast gathering of warriors lining the shore, armed and ready for battle. The Britons, it seemed, were determined to resist the invasion. Their numbers were unclear, but it was obvious that they had anticipated Caesar's arrival. Armed with spears, shields and chariots, the Britons cut an imposing figure against the backdrop of the cliffs. To land on that beach would not be easy. Caesar's initial attempt to land met with disaster. The Roman fleet, unfamiliar with the treacherous tides and currents of the Channel, struggled to find a suitable landing point. The ships, designed for river and coastal warfare in the Mediterranean, were not built for the rough open waters of the Channel. As they approached the shore, many of the ships were caught in the surf, their soldiers forced to disembark in deep water. Laden with heavy armour and shields, the Roman legionaries found themselves struggling to wade through the waves, all while under constant attack from the Britons, who hurled spears and stones from the safety of the shore. For the first time in his career, Caesar's legions faced the real possibility of defeat before they had even set foot on land. The Britons, with their chariots and light infantry, were ideally suited for this type of hit-and-run warfare. They darted in and out of the surf, attacking the Romans at will, and then retreating out of range before the heavily armoured legionaries could respond. The Romans, for all their discipline and training, were at a severe disadvantage. They could not form their famous battle lines in the water, nor could they effectively use their pilum, throwing spears, or gladius, short swords, in such conditions. Caesar, however, was not one to give up easily. Seeing the chaos unfolding on the shore, he personally intervened, rallying his men with a show of courage and leadership. Plunging into the water himself, Caesar ordered his troops to push forward and secure a foothold on the beach. His presence, along with the sight of the legionary standard-bearers wading into the fray, gave the soldiers the morale boost they desperately needed. Slowly but surely, the Romans began to gain ground, inching their way closer to the shore. The battle on the beach was fierce and chaotic. The Britons fought with a ferocity that surprised even the battle-hardened Roman soldiers. Their chariots in particular proved to be a formidable weapon. These were not simple carts, but highly maneuverable vehicles driven by skilled warriors. The charioteers would charge into the Roman ranks, hurling javelins before retreating, only to repeat the process moments later. The Britons also had the advantage of knowing the terrain, using the marshy ground and shifting tides to their benefit. Yet, for all their bravery and tenacity, the Britons lacked the discipline and organization of the Roman legions. Slowly, the Romans began to assert control over the battlefield. The legionaries, once they had reached solid ground, formed into their famous testudo tortoise formation, interlocking their shields to create an impenetrable wall. Under the cover of their shields, the Romans advanced methodically, pushing the Britons back step by step. The tide of battle began to turn. As the day wore on, the Britons found themselves increasingly on the defensive. Their initial attacks, though effective, had failed to break the Roman lines. The discipline and training of Caesar's soldiers began to wear down the Britons' resolve. The Roman cavalry, having finally disembarked from the ships, now joined the fray, charging into the Britons' flanks and breaking their formations. The Britons, realizing that they could not hold the beach, began to retreat into the interior, leaving the Romans in control of the shoreline. Caesar had won the day, but it was a costly and hard-fought victory. The beach was littered with the bodies of both Roman and Briton warriors, and many of Caesar's ships had been damaged by the rough seas and the battle itself. Nevertheless, the Romans had secured a foothold in Britain, albeit a tenuous one. The Britons had retreated, but they were far from defeated. Caesar knew that this was only the beginning of his campaign in Britain, and the real test of his army's strength and endurance lay ahead. In the days that followed the battle, Caesar attempted to solidify his position on the coast. He sent out scouting parties to gather intelligence on the Britons and their lands, hoping to learn more about this mysterious island. The Britons, for their part, remained elusive, retreating into the hills and forests, avoiding open conflict with the Roman forces. Caesar's men built fortifications along the coast, preparing for the inevitable counterattack. Yet, despite the victory, the realities of the campaign soon began to weigh heavily on Caesar. Britain was not like Gaul. The terrain was unfamiliar, the weather unpredictable, and the logistical challenges immense. The Britons, though divided among various tribes, proved to be resilient and resourceful enemies. Caesar's supply lines, stretched across the Channel, were vulnerable to disruption, and his fleet had suffered significant damage in the crossing. Winter was approaching, and Caesar knew that he could not afford to linger in Britain for much longer. The expected counterattack from the Britons came sooner than Caesar had anticipated. Led by their tribal chieftains, the Britons launched a series of hit-and-run raids on the Roman camp, testing the defences and probing for weaknesses. The Roman legions, exhausted from the previous battle, found themselves under constant pressure. The Britons, using their knowledge of the terrain, attacked at night or in poor weather, making it difficult for the Romans to respond effectively. Despite these challenges, Caesar remained determined to press forward. He sent envoys to the local tribes, hoping to negotiate alliances or at least neutralize potential enemies. Some of the tribes, impressed by the might of Rome, agreed to cease hostilities and provide hostages as a sign of goodwill. Others, however, continued to resist, launching sporadic attacks on Roman positions. As the campaign dragged on, Caesar began to realize that his initial goals for the invasion were becoming increasingly difficult to achieve. He had hoped to conquer Britain quickly, establishing Roman dominance over the island and cutting off support for the rebellious tribes in Gaul. But the Britons were proving to be far more tenacious than he had anticipated. and the logistical difficulties of maintaining a prolonged campaign in such a distant and hostile land were becoming more apparent with each passing day. In the end, it was not the Britons who forced Caesar to withdraw, but the elements. A violent storm swept through the Channel, wreaking havoc on the Roman fleet. Many of the ships that had been damaged during the crossing were now beyond repair, and Caesar found himself cut off from his supply lines. With winter fast approaching and his fleet in disarray, Caesar made the difficult decision to abandon his campaign and return to Gaul. The withdrawal from Britain was conducted with as much order as possible under the circumstances, but it was clear to all that the campaign had not achieved its intended goals. Caesar had landed in Britain, fought and won a battle, and secured a temporary foothold, but he had failed to conquer the island or impose Roman rule. The Britons, for their part, had demonstrated that they were not easily subdued, and their resistance would continue for years to come. Caesar's first invasion of Britain had ended in a stalemate of sorts. He had not been defeated, but neither had he achieved the decisive victory he had sought. Nevertheless, the campaign was not without its rewards. Caesar had gained valuable intelligence about the island and its people, and he had shown the Britons that Rome was a force to be reckoned with. Moreover, the invasion had bolstered Caesar's reputation back in Rome, where news of the expedition was greeted with enthusiasm and admiration. The Battle of the Beachhead, though a relatively small engagement in the grand scope of Caesar's career, marked a significant moment in Roman history. It was the first time that a Roman army had crossed the Channel and engaged with the peoples of Britain, setting the stage for future invasions and the eventual Roman conquest of the island. For Caesar, it was another step in his quest for glory and power, a journey that would ultimately lead him to the pinnacle of Roman politics and eventually his fateful march on Rome. Though Caesar would return to Britain the following year for a second invasion, the lessons of the Battle of the Beachhead would stay with him. The Britons were not to be underestimated, and the challenges of waging war in such a distant and unfamiliar land would continue to test even the greatest general of his time. But on that fateful day in 55 BCE, as the Roman legions stood victorious on the shores of Britain, it was clear to all that a new chapter in the history of Rome and Britain had begun. The smoke from the battle at the beachhead still lingered as Caesar's legions regrouped, but there was no time for rest. With the shore secured, the next phase of the invasion began. The Roman army advanced inland, its soldiers marching cautiously, alert to every sound and shadow. The distant hills and dense forests, unfamiliar to the Roman soldiers, loomed like barriers to their progress. Caesar knew that the Britons would not simply melt away into the countryside. They would continue to resist, and the skirmishes that followed would become a battle of attrition, testing his army's endurance and patience. The Britons, though defeated on the beach, were far from broken. Caesar's men had fought their way onto British soil, but the native warriors had melted into the landscape, ready to harass the advancing Romans at every turn. The Celts had no interest in meeting Caesar's legions in open battle. They knew that they would not survive a direct confrontation. Instead, they employed guerrilla tactics, a strategy that would frustrate and slow the Roman advance as it pushed deeper into Britain. Caesar's legions marched inland, their formations tight and disciplined, with cavalry units scouting ahead and along the flanks. The terrain, though not entirely unfamiliar, was different from the fields of Gaul or the open plains of Europe, where the legions had honed their skills. The British landscape was rough, a mix of forests, hills and marshes that provided ample cover for the Britons to launch surprise attacks. It was terrain where the heavily armoured Roman soldiers were at a disadvantage, and Caesar knew this all too well. The first signs of trouble appeared shortly after the Romans had set out from the beach. Scouts reported seeing small bands of Briton warriors on the outskirts of the Roman column, observing the army's movements from the cover of the trees. Caesar was not surprised. He had expected as much. His soldiers, however, were tense. They had heard stories of the Britons' ferocity and knew that they were now deep in enemy territory. It wasn't long before the first ambush occurred. The Romans were advancing along a narrow path flanked by thick woods when a sudden hail of javelins rained down upon them. Briton warriors had hidden themselves in the trees and struck at the perfect moment, catching the Romans off guard. The legionaries, trained to respond quickly, raised their shields in a protective wall, their famous discipline on full display. But the Britons had already melted back into the forest, leaving behind nothing but their projectiles and the few wounded Romans who had not reacted fast enough. This was the first of many such encounters. The Britons had mastered the art of guerrilla warfare, using the terrain to their advantage. They attacked swiftly and then vanished just as quickly, leaving the Roman soldiers frustrated and uneasy. The enemy was always there, always watching, but rarely did they engage for long enough to allow the Romans to strike back effectively. Caesar's legions, though disciplined and battle-hardened, were not used to this style of fighting. They had been trained for open-field battles, where formations and tactics could be used to break an enemy's line. Here, in the wilds of Britain, there were no such lines to break. The Britons did not stand and fight. They struck, retreated, and struck again, always staying just out of reach. The Britons' use of chariots, in particular, added a new element of danger. These fast, lightweight vehicles allowed the Britons to strike from a distance, hurling javelins before retreating back into the safety of the woods. The Romans had not faced many charioteers in their previous campaigns, and the speed and mobility of these warriors was a constant menace. The charioteers would ride close to the Roman lines, throwing their weapons and then disappearing before the Romans could organize a proper counterattack. Despite the Britons' guerrilla tactics, Caesar's legions pressed forward. The Roman army was a disciplined machine, and even in the face of such elusive opponents, they maintained their order. Caesar ordered his legions to form tighter marching columns, with scouts and cavalry units constantly patrolling the flanks and the rear. He knew that the Britons would continue to harass his army, but he also knew that the Romans could withstand it. His soldiers were trained for endurance as much as for battle, and they had been in far worse situations before. Yet, as the days passed, the constant skirmishes began to take their toll. Every mile was contested, every night was restless. The Britons attacked at all hours, sometimes in the dead of night, hoping to catch the Romans off guard. They struck from the shadows, never giving the Romans a moment of peace. The legionaries, though still maintaining their discipline, were growing weary. Sleep was hard to come by, and the stress of always being on alert wore them down. Caesar, realizing the toll the skirmishes were taking on his men, adapted his strategy. Each night, his engineers built fortified camps, complete with trenches and palisades to protect the legions from nighttime raids. These camps became a symbol of Roman resilience. No matter how many times the Britons attacked, they could not break through the defenses. The Romans would rest within their walls, gaining the strength they needed to continue the next day. The Britons, however, did not relent. They had no need for a decisive battle. Their goal was to slow the Romans, wear them down, and make the cost of the invasion too high. They attacked supply lines, ambushed small groups of Roman soldiers, and set traps along the paths the legions traveled. The war was not one of grand confrontations, but of constant pressure and harassment. It was a war of patience, and the Britons were determined to outlast the invaders. Caesar's frustration grew as the campaign dragged on. His objective was to force a decisive engagement, to bring the Britons to the negotiating table or to defeat them outright. But the Britons refused to give him that opportunity. Instead, they fought on their own terms, never allowing the Romans to dictate the course of battle. Despite the difficulties, Caesar managed to make progress. His scouts captured a group of Briton warriors during one of the skirmishes, and from them he learned that the Briton tribes were not as united as they appeared. There were divisions among them. Some wanted to continue the fight, while others were beginning to see the futility of opposing the Romans. Seizing on this information, Caesar sent emissaries to the local tribes offering terms of peace. He promised leniency in exchange for their submission and hostages. Some of the tribes, weary from the constant fighting and impressed by the might of Rome, accepted Caesar's offer. They saw that continued resistance would only lead to more destruction, and they chose to align themselves with the Romans. Others, however, remained defiant, continuing their raids and attacks on Roman positions. The skirmishes, though less frequent now, still occurred, but the Britons' numbers had dwindled. Those who continued to fight found themselves increasingly isolated. The Romans, now more familiar with the Britons' tactics, began to anticipate their movements. Caesar's legions, once unaccustomed to guerrilla warfare, had adapted. They moved with more caution, their scouts more vigilant, and their fortifications more secure. As the campaign wore on, Caesar recognized the limitations of his position. The invasion had been more difficult than he had anticipated, and though he had secured some victories, he knew that a prolonged stay in Britain was unsustainable. His fleet, damaged by storms, needed repair, and his supply lines were stretched thin. Winter was approaching, and the thought of being stranded in Britain with dwindling resources was a risk he could not afford to take. Caesar made the decision to pull back toward the coast. The Britons, realizing that the Romans were retreating, launched a few final raids, hoping to weaken Caesar's forces before they could withdraw. But the Roman legions, now seasoned by weeks of constant skirmishing, repelled the attacks with ease. Their discipline and organization had only strengthened as the campaign progressed, and they marched back to the coast in good order, leaving behind no easy targets for the Britons. By the time Caesar's legions reached the shore, it was clear that the first invasion of Britain had come to an end. Caesar had not conquered the island, but he had achieved enough to consider the campaign a success. He had secured alliances with some of the local tribes, demonstrated Rome's military prowess, and gathered valuable intelligence about the Britons and their land. Though the invasion had not resulted in a decisive victory, it had laid the groundwork for future campaigns. For the Roman soldiers, the skirmishes during the inland advance were a grueling experience. They had faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before, one that refused to engage on Roman terms. Yet they had adapted, survived, and ultimately succeeded in their mission. Caesar, always the pragmatist, had learned much from the campaign, about the Britons, about guerrilla warfare, and about the challenges of invading a land so far from Rome's core territories. The first Roman invasion of Britain had begun with a bloody battle at the beachhead, but it was in the skirmishes that followed where the true test of Roman endurance had taken place. Every step inland had been fought for, and every victory had been hard won. Though the campaign had ended with a withdrawal, it was clear that this was only the beginning of Rome's interest in Britain. Caesar would return, and when he did, he would be ready for the challenges that awaited him. The Roman legions had fought their way inland, encountering fierce resistance from the Britons at every turn. Through countless skirmishes and guerrilla tactics, the Britons had slowed Caesar's advance, but the Romans had secured a foothold on British soil. Caesar, ever the master strategist, had adapted his tactics to meet the challenges of this strange new land. However, a greater threat than the Britons loomed on the horizon. Nature itself was about to intervene, and with winter fast approaching, Caesar would face one of the greatest setbacks of his first invasion of Britain, the storm that nearly crippled his entire campaign. After weeks of constant skirmishes, Caesar's legions finally reached a point where they could consolidate their gains. Having formed alliances with some local tribes and made progress in understanding the land and its people, Caesar knew that his position, while precarious, was stable for the time being. But the legions were weary, their supplies strained, and the unpredictable British weather had turned against them. Caesar had hoped to push further inland and perhaps force the Britons into a decisive battle. He was determined to bring them under Roman control, knowing that a full conquest of Britain would bolster his reputation back in Rome. But his campaign was at the mercy of the elements, and the first signs of trouble came with the onset of harsh autumn winds. His fleet, which had been the lifeline of the invasion, was anchored off the coast, supplying the legions as they pushed further into British territory. These ships were not just Caesar's means of resupplying his men, but his only means of retreat if things went wrong. The Channel's treacherous tides and storms were something the Romans had underestimated. While the Mediterranean had its share of unpredictable weather, the North Sea and Channel were far more volatile, and Caesar's fleet was unprepared for what was about to happen. The storm struck without warning. Dark clouds gathered over the sea, and soon the wind began to howl, whipping up the water into a fury. The waves crashed violently against the Roman ships, tossing them about like leaves in a storm. The soldiers stationed on the coast could only watch helplessly as the storm grew in intensity, battering the fleet that had brought them to Britain. The ships, designed for river crossings and coastal waters, were not built to withstand the ferocity of the open sea. Many were driven ashore, wrecked against the rocky coastline, while others were swamped by the towering waves, sinking beneath the turbulent waters. For the Romans, the sight of their fleet being decimated by the storm was nothing short of disastrous. The soldiers on land had no way of communicating with the ships, and Caesar himself could only look on in disbelief as his carefully laid plans began to unravel. His fleet was his lifeline, and without it, his position in Britain became untenable. When the storm finally passed, the extent of the damage was clear. Dozens of ships had been destroyed, leaving Caesar's army stranded with little hope of resupply. The surviving vessels had been severely damaged, many beyond repair, and the fleet was in no shape to provide the logistical support necessary to continue the campaign. Caesar faced a grim reality. Without his fleet, he could neither sustain his legions nor return them to the continent. What had started as a bold expedition now risked becoming a disaster of epic proportions. Caesar's immediate concern was the safety of his men. The Britons, who had watched the storm wreak havoc on the Roman fleet, sensed an opportunity to strike. Though they had been cautious about engaging the Romans in open battle, they knew that Caesar's position had been weakened. If they could launch a coordinated assault on the Roman encampments, they might force Caesar to retreat or even inflict a devastating defeat. But Caesar was not a man to be easily shaken, even in the face of such adversity. He quickly ordered his engineers to begin repairing the ships that could be salvaged. The Roman engineers, renowned for their ingenuity and skill, worked tirelessly to restore the vessels. But it was clear that the damage was severe. Time was not on Caesar's side. Winter was approaching, and with it, the dangers of being stranded in a foreign land without adequate supplies. Meanwhile, Caesar had to keep his legions ready for battle. He fortified the Roman camps, ordering his men to construct deeper ditches and stronger walls, anticipating an attack from the Britons. The soldiers, though weary from weeks of fighting and constant skirmishes, responded to Caesar's commands with the discipline that had made the Roman army the most feared force in the world. Even with their fleet in ruins and supplies running low, the Romans remained a formidable fighting force. The Britons, however, were not blind to Caesar's vulnerability. They increased their raids on Roman positions, testing the defences and looking for weak points. Though Caesar's legions managed to repel these attacks, it became clear that the Britons were biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Caesar knew that he could not afford to remain in Britain any longer. The storm had left him with no choice. His men were far from their supply lines, and without a fully operational fleet, they were effectively cut off from reinforcements and provisions. The situation was becoming increasingly dire, and the prospect of being trapped in Britain through the winter, with his men starving and under constant attack, was something Caesar could not risk. Reluctantly, Caesar made the decision to withdraw. It was a bitter choice for a man who prided himself on his ability to turn even the most challenging situations to his advantage. The withdrawal would not be easy, but Caesar knew that survival was more important than continuing a campaign that now seemed impossible to win. His legions, though they had fought bravely and secured important victories, could not sustain themselves in Britain with the fleet in ruins. Caesar ordered his men to begin preparations for the retreat. The ships that had been repaired were loaded with the most essential supplies, and the legions prepared to march back to the coast. The withdrawal had to be swift and organized, for the Britons were watching their every move. Any sign of weakness could prompt a full-scale attack, and Caesar could not afford to lose men in a chaotic retreat. As the legions began their march toward the coast, the Britons launched a series of raids, hoping to disrupt the Romans' plans and force them into a disorganized retreat. But Caesar's soldiers, though weary and disheartened, maintained their discipline. Every raid was met with a swift and deadly response, the Romans forming their famous defensive formations and driving the Britons back. The journey back to the coast was fraught with tension. The Britons continued to harass the Romans, and the unpredictable weather made every step a challenge. But Caesar, ever the leader, kept his men focused on the task at hand. He knew that the key to a successful withdrawal was maintaining order and preventing panic from setting in. Finally, after days of grueling marches and constant skirmishes, the Romans reached the coast. The sight of the surviving ships, battered but still afloat, must have been a welcome relief for the exhausted legionaries. The fleet had been decimated, but it was still capable of carrying Caesar's army back to Gaul. The withdrawal from Britain was conducted with the same discipline that had marked Caesar's entire campaign. The Romans loaded the repaired ships with as many soldiers and supplies as they could, while the remaining men waited on the shore for their turn to board. Caesar himself oversaw the operation, ensuring that no man was left behind and that the withdrawal proceeded smoothly. The Britons, perhaps sensing that the Romans were leaving for good, launched one final raid on the Roman positions. But the Romans, even in retreat, were still a force to be reckoned with. They repelled the attack with ease, the legionaries holding their ground and driving the Britons back. It was a fitting end to a campaign that had tested the mettle of both sides. As Caesar's ships set sail for Gaul, the legions must have reflected on the challenges they had faced. The invasion of Britain had been a bold and ambitious endeavor, but it had not gone as planned. The storm had dealt a crippling blow to Caesar's campaign, forcing him to abandon his plans for conquest and withdraw from the island. Yet, despite the setbacks, Caesar's soldiers had performed admirably. They had survived constant skirmishes, outlasted the Britons' guerrilla tactics, and faced the fury of nature itself. They had not been defeated, but circumstances had forced their hand. For Caesar, the invasion of Britain was a valuable lesson. He had learned much about the Britons, their tactics, and the challenges of campaigning in such a distant and unfamiliar land. Though he had been forced to withdraw, he had laid the groundwork for future Roman expeditions to Britain. Caesar would return, but this time he would be better prepared for the challenges that awaited him. The storm and subsequent withdrawal marked the end of Caesar's first invasion of Britain. It had been a campaign of high hopes and dashed ambitions, of victories and unforeseen disasters. But as the Roman ships sailed away from the shores of Britain, it was clear that this was not the end of Rome's interest in the island. Caesar had shown that Rome could reach the farthest corners of the known world, and though he had been forced to retreat, the legacy of his invasion would live on.